5, 3, 9, 7, 1, 5.
Hello, and welcome back again to Bigfoot for Breakfast, home of the mysterious and the macabre, where we sit in the studio week after week challenging conventional thought. We are your hosts, Sarah Jones
and Samantha Carter.
We have to remind you all to please push the subscribe button on whichever podcast platform you happen to be listening from, and don't forget to leave us a rating and a review, because we love hearing from you guys. We want to thank you guys for coming back week after week and tell you that we really appreciate you listening to our little show. If you want to help us out even more, tell a friend. Word of mouth is a great way to get new listeners, and if you really want to help us out, check out our Patreon. If you want to get a hold of us for any reason, to give a show suggestion, criticize our personalities, tell us how cool we are, or just say hey, we would love that too, and you can sure do that via Facebook, Instagram, or the Twitter. You can also leave us a voicemail or text 641-812-2635, and we'll play it on the next episode. With that, let's take a nosedive into the seemingly endless mystery that is the assassination of the late, great John F. Kennedy. There's a lot of information to unpack here, folks, so although this will be a two-parter, they will be pretty fast-moving episodes as we try to fit as much as we can into each episode.
The History of North America podcast is a sweeping historical saga of the United States, Canada, and Mexico, from their deep origins to our present epoch. Join me, Mark Vinette, on this exciting, fascinating, epic journey through time, focusing on the compelling, wonderful, and tragic stories of North America's inhabitants, heroes, villains, leaders, environment, and geography. The History of North America podcast series is an incredible historical adventure that chronicles the thrilling, action-packed tale of a continent. I invite you to come along for the ride.
12:30 p.m., Dallas, Texas, 11/22/1963. President John Fitzgerald Kennedy, as seen in many old photographs and videos, was riding in the back of his black convertible Lincoln Continental limo with his wife, Jackie. Jackie, being ever so timeless, was all done up in her famous pink suit and hat. It was a nice change for people to see Jackie Kennedy in the company of her husband, because the past couple of months she had kept a pretty low profile and taken kind of a little break from the public after the passing of their third baby, Patrick. Patrick had been born with hyaline membrane disease and passed away 2 days after he had been born. That had only just happened in August. John and Jackie had 2 older children at home, Caroline and John Jr. The car was moving at a slow pace, the way a parade would, through Dealey Plaza, while the 2 of them waved at onlookers who happily cheered their names as they passed. The arrival of the president and his route through Dealey Plaza that day had been announced in the newspapers, so quite a little crowd had accumulated along the roadside.
He had been president for 3 years at this point, 1 year away from possible re-election in 1964 for a second term, and he had been keeping busy campaigning throughout America. He had been traveling all over the western U.S. the past month, and he was making a point to hit both Florida and Texas on his way back up to D.C., since they were both key states that he would need to win in a second election. It wasn't only that he needed to win those states, though. He made it a point to hit Texas, especially due to the fact that the Democratic Party in Texas was in really bad shape. They were dealing with a lot of extremists, opposition, and fighting within the party itself. He needed to get them together to work some things out before he could move forward in his important election year. The politicians and Secret Service had been made aware of the potentially volatile political climate in Texas, especially since an ambassador, Adlai Stevenson, had just previously been assaulted while in Dallas. And by assaulted, I mean a venue at which he was giving a speech was pretty much taken over by extremists marching with upside-down flags and yelling obscenities at him. These people were followers of General Walker, and we'll tell you about him a little bit later. They were shouting, "Kennedy to hell," and "Stevenson's going to die." As Stevenson was exiting the venue and hurrying to his car, he notices a woman shouting at him angrily, and he tries to stop and speak with her peacefully. Unfortunately, she was carrying a large plywood sign, and the woman lunged at Stevenson, knocking him in the head with the wooden sign, as other protesters descended onto him and spit in his face while he was trying to get into his car to leave.
On the day of the Kennedy motorcade through Dallas, it's said that the weather was clear and beautiful, 67 degrees with a slight breeze. It had rained earlier in the day while they moved through Fort Worth, where Kennedy had started his day. He had been speaking to people in crowds there, but then took a plane to Dallas, landing at Love Field. The weather cleared right up just in time for the motorcade to pass through Dallas from Love Field to the Trade Mart, where people waited for him to come and speak. In the limo, John and Jackie sat in the very back. The Texas Governor, John Connally, sat directly in front of John, and Governor Connally's wife, Nellie, sat directly in front of Jackie. With the weather in Dallas being more than agreeable, they asked the Secret Service to take the bubble off of the car, and they drove with the top down, leaving JFK and his wife fully visible to people who wanted to see them go by. And that was the point, wasn't it? To be presentable to the people, to connect with them. People had shown up from all over. People who wanted their kids to see them, people who just wanted to be acknowledged by a person that they thought to be one of the greatest and most progressive presidents that America had seen thus far. But not everyone in the Dallas Dealey Plaza who had come to see John Kennedy pass by had such good intention. There's no question about that. What was to come into question, though, was exactly who it was that would go so far as to kill the President of the United States at this moment while he was wide open in the front of his many followers and their children while they hid behind the shadows or in the window of an old book depository. Or in the shadow of a fence on the grassy knoll. Or was it and the shadows of a fence on the grassy knoll? So, I heard a rumor that someone here is actually an owl in disguise.
Who?
Wait, what'd you say?
I didn't see that coming at all. Completely took me by surprise. Okay. So obviously, though, we're getting ahead of ourselves. There's a whole lot more to the story than the assassination of JFK itself. Let's talk about who JFK was in the first place. We're going to give you a brief run through. He was a brother of both Ted Kennedy and Robert Kennedy, who we've previously done episodes on. And just like we did with Robert, we need to talk about some of the things that JFK did, his accomplishments, his downfalls, and importantly, his friends and acquaintances in order to gain a better understanding of what happened to him, or at least gain somewhat of an idea as to why.
In the Robert Kennedy episode, we talked briefly about their father, Joe. He was a driven man who expected a lot from his kids. He wanted them front and center, making headway for their already very well-off family to become one of the most powerful, wealthy, and influential families in American history. And we could say that he definitely got his wish.
John F. Kennedy seemed to have been prepped for the presidency for a lot of his life. He came from the right family, they set goals for him, sent him to the right schools, he even married the right girl, Jackie Bouvier Kennedy. He served time in the Navy and received heroic honors for leading his men to safety after their boat was attacked by the Japanese. In 1960, he beat out Richard Nixon for the presidency and he became the youngest elected United States president ever at 43 years old.
During his presidency, he led the United States out of a long-standing economic recession in the early 60s that continued to grow and prosper until about 1969, well after his death.
Which they said was one of the longest running good economic times we've had in history.
In 1961, he established the Peace Corps that allowed American volunteers to go overseas to help underdeveloped nations improve in areas of farming, education, healthcare, and construction. He spoke with USSR leader Nikita Khrushchev to avert the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, making a deal with the USSR that the United States wouldn't invade Cuba unless provoked if the USSR would take their nuclear missiles out of Cuba and stop pointing them at us. The American people really appreciated that, but we all know from watching First Class that it was actually the X-Men that saved us all, so I'm just saying.
So not all JFK. He was extremely progressive also in the civil rights area. He was pro-civil rights and always seemed to do whatever it took to try to even the playing field and help out civil rights leaders. He signed the executive order for affirmative action in 1961, ensuring that employers treat employees equally and hire equally. In 1962, he banned segregation in federal housing and encouraged integration in schools and public facilities. He was also big on domestic programs and providing assistance to help disenfranchised areas and populations get a leg up. In 1963, he signed the Equal Pay Act that would help close the wage gap between men and women.
Like we said earlier in the episode, that morning was a busy one for the Kennedys. They started at the Hotel Texas where John Kennedy made a speech. He shook hands with the crowd, talked to people, and made himself as available as he could for the Texas folks who might be voting for him. He had even instructed the Secret Service to pretty much keep their distance so that he could do this without their interference and so Kennedy could appear to be more approachable. This was the reason that the Secret Service was not in the car with the Kennedys while they drove along in the motorcade. John Kennedy had instructed that they remain in the car directly behind him. And remember, he had also instructed them to remove the bubble top from the convertible so that he could be seen and that he could wave to the onlookers, and all of this likely contributed a great deal to making him such an easy target that day in Dallas.
The motorcade route itself would come under suspicion as it was chosen by the Secret Service and was said to have had far too many turns. Obviously, this is something that they try to avoid because for turns, motorcade has to slow down. If there's a mob present, it gives them the opportunity to attack, and it also makes a person an easy shot for a gunman. Now, I'm sure that subsequent Secret Service protocols were amended following this incident. The Secret Service at the time of the Kennedy presidency had never experienced an assassination, so I'm not sure that they were necessarily lax in their job here, or if they just didn't realize how secure they needed to be until something bad happened. Another subject of scrutiny was that along this route and through Dealey Plaza, it was said that there were actually over 20,000 windows that Kennedy would pass by, and they were not checked prior to him entering the plaza at a slow rate of speed.
Apparently, that is not a thing now. Nowadays, the cities are scouted months in advance. The cops are asked about any problem people, and those people are warned ahead of time that they'll be watching them. The records seem conflicting here because some sources state that the police and FBI in Dallas were not made aware of the motorcade route prior to it happening, and subsequently the Secret Service was not warned of any potential threat that might be present on the route, even though the political climate was actually pretty tense and dangerous in Texas at this time. Other sources claim that police and FBI assisted to secure the route ahead of time since Ambassador Adlai Stevenson had just been assaulted by an angry mob and injured as he was trying to speak in Dallas. In the JFK Information Archives, though, it does state that a Secret Service agent checked the geographic indexes for listings of persons who may be a potential threat and found none. They did ask for some photos of people who had been involved in that assault against Adlai Stevenson, and while the Secret Service was standing at the Trade Mart waiting for the president to arrive, they scoped out the crowd and removed a few people who resembled the activists in the photos. The Secret Service was also made aware of a flyer that was circulating the streets of Dallas. It was a paper with Kennedy's photo at the top that said "Wanted for treason." It then went on to list 7 reasons why this was. In short, this flyer accused him of 1. Betraying the Constitution, 2. Being wrong on national security issues, 3. Being lax on communism, 4. Encouraging communists, 5. Illegally invading a sovereign state, 6. Appointing anti-Christians to office, and 7. Being caught in lies to the people.
Before they left the Hotel Texas, Kennedy is reported to have made a comment to his wife in passing regarding their drive through Fort Worth late the night before. He said to her, last night would have been a hell of a night to assassinate a president.
According to a loose timeline put together by Business Insiders, and keep in mind that this is a timeline based off of the initial investigation done by the Warren Commission after the assassination. Kennedy stopped his own motorcade at 12:05 a.m. in order to shake hands with the crowd for approximately 5 minutes. This is midnight?
No.
12:05 p.m.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Kennedy stopped his own motorcade. I was like, I'm pretty sure the videos were bright and sunny.
It was. Very much misinformation.
Kennedy stopped his motorcade at 12:05 p.m. in order to shake hands with the crowd for approximately 5 minutes. A few more stops were made along the way. By 12:29, the motorcade is turning left from Houston Street onto Elm Street, and from here it is a straight shot, no pun intended, into Dealey Plaza. Almost immediately after their turn, bam, the first shot is fired. It misses. A few people heard the loud pop and looked around, confused. Later, it was reported by many of them that they thought it was the backfire of one of the cars in the plaza. A few people would later report that they thought it was kids playing with firecrackers. However, one man named James Tague was standing next to an overpass, and either this bullet or some debris from the bullet did hit him, as it was thought to have hit the curb next to him. He was likely the only person who was aware of anything amiss in this moment, but not for long.
Less than 1 minute after the first bullet was fired, 2 more shots rang out in quick succession. Bam, bam. The second shot sent the president hunching forward, arms up by the headrest. He sat for a second or two in what was frequently referred to as classic Thorburn position. Remember that term, Thornburn position, because it'll be important later on and it will come into question. This shot was thought to have gone through the base of John Kennedy's neck, exit out the front of his neck, go through the seat in front of him and hit Governor Connolly in the right side of his upper back, exit the front of Connolly's chest, and go through Connolly's wrist before it came to rest in his thigh, as he was sitting in the seat directly in front of the president. Governor Connolly's wife seemed to immediately know that he was injured. As she pulled him toward her, the governor could be heard saying, "No, no, 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 my God, they're going to kill us all." Governor Connolly has interviewed several times since then, stating that he is positive that he was hit by an entirely separate bullet than that which hit President Kennedy. His wife, who is sitting beside him, agrees with her husband. So basically what they're saying is that the first shot came from behind, hit Kennedy in the neck, went through his neck into Connolly, who is in the seat in front of him, entered through the right upper part of his back, went down his chest, out of his chest, through his wrist, and into his thigh. So it went through both of them.
Magic.
Well, we'll talk about magic later.
What do you mean?
Because the...
I'm just kidding.
Well, that theory that we just talked about is called the single bullet theory. And later on, we'll come into another theory called the magic bullet theory, and you'll see why this is all important.
The third shot comes now, and it hits John Kennedy on the right posterior area of his head. The last shot causes a large part of his skull to blow out onto the back of the car. Jackie Kennedy, frantic now, starts to stand up in the speeding automobile, climb out onto the back of the car as a Secret Service agent who has come running from the car behind them climbs up onto the car from the back. I'm sure that this Secret Service agent was frantic too, because despite all of the training that we are sure that they received, this had been the first presidential assassination since the Secret Service agency was formed and began protecting United States presidents. When he starts to climb up on the car from the back, Jackie turns around and sits back down in the seat as she is reportedly screaming, "Oh God, oh God." What we did not specify previously was that she climbed on the trunk of the car, collecting his belongings.
Like by his belongings, you mean his skull.
And pieces of his brain, yes.
Mm-hmm.
So
I think she was in quite the state of shock.
She was screaming, oh God, no." And all of this can be seen in the various videos that were taken that day. The limo is speeding away now out of Dealey Plaza and away from the unseen danger. They are headed straight for Parkland Hospital in Dallas to get medical attention for the president.
So at this point, the sheriff, Bill Decker, is on the ground in Dealey Plaza screaming for officers to check the railroad tracks behind a fence. The fence is located on the grassy knoll just off the road in Dealey Plaza. Other police officers are running frantically from building to building trying to find anyone who may be the shooter. Anyone strange who doesn't belong in the building. Anyone that looks suspicious. They're quickly questioning people as to whether or not they saw anything. Simultaneously, a man named Lee Harvey Oswald is buying a Coke from a vending machine in the book depository for Texas College. He was an employee. Per later testimony in a courtroom by a woman named Mrs. Ruth Payne, Lee Harvey Oswald had gotten this job not long before the day of the shooting. She had met Oswald at a party and drove him and his wife home. During the drive, Oswald had mentioned that he was looking for work and he seemed super discouraged that he had not found a job. She had called the book depository for him, inquiring about a job, and sent him to apply the next day. She described him at this time as clean-shaven and very presentable. At the time of the shooting, though, Oswald and his wife, Marina, had been living separately. It was said that Oswald was abusive and unstable. He was living in a boarding house in Oak Cliff, Texas, and his pregnant wife was living with the same woman who had gotten him the job in the first place, Ruth Payne. Mrs. Payne didn't think highly of Oswald's unstable behavior and the fact that he had trouble keeping a job to support his family.
A man named Buell Wesley Fraser would later testify that he was the one who drove Lee Harvey Oswald to work that morning because Oswald did not know how to drive.
Oswald.
What?
Sorry. Oswald. Go ahead. Sorry. Just had to.
No, I can't talk. He picked him up that morning, listened to the news on the radio as they rode for 20 minutes into Dealey Plaza. It seemed to be a pretty normal morning, as Fraser would state that Oswald was, quote, just his typical old self. He didn't talk much. They never do.
I don't know. Ted Bundy. Well, he's not an assassinator. Totally different crimes.
Yeah.
Never mind. Again.
The only thing that seemed off was the package that Oswald had with him that morning. It was long and wrapped in brown paper. Fraser had asked Oswald about the package, and Oswald told him that it was curtain rods for his room at the boarding house in Oak Cliff. Oh shit. Not Oak Cliff. Frazier would also testify later that Oswald had lately been trying hard to get his family back and that he seemed to really miss his 2 daughters. Despite this, Frazier also said that if he was planning to shoot John F. Kennedy that morning, he didn't indicate it at all, as one probably wouldn't.
Yeah, but you would think, with so much pressure on you, and if you're the only one who has this big plan to assassinate a president, you would think that you would act more nervous. You'd be able to tell that he was more quiet that day, but he said he just acted totally normal, like just his relaxed, quiet self. You think there would be some indication. Like, yeah, he was more stressed out that morning or somewhat anxious.
Well, maybe his baseline is cold, calculated, and always thinking about murder.
You would think his palms would be sweaty.
Knees weak,
There was,
vomit
like-
on his sweater already. You had sounded
But you
like
go ahead, Sam.
it
Go ahead.
sounded like you were going in a different direction. I was trying to annoy you.
Well, it did happen.
I
Okay.
thought you were saying something else, and I was just trying to interrupt you. He was getting a Coke.
But back to the story. Oswald had just gotten a Coke out of the vending machine and he seemed unaware of what was going on per witnesses. A police officer named Marion Baker was running through the building with the supervisor when he encountered Oswald in the break room and briefly spoke to him. Officer Baker verified with the supervisor that Oswald did work there before he went ahead and moved along to check out the rest of the building. At this point, the supervisor had informed a seemingly unaware Oswald that the president had been shot before he followed Officer Baker up the stairs to check out the other floors of the building. Later testimony from Oswald's supervisor and co-workers would tell the investigators that Oswald looked completely relaxed. He truly just seemed to have no idea what was going on, and he didn't appear sweaty, out of breath, or nervous at all. He was just getting a Coke.
I'll have a Coke.
Yep, a liter of cola.
From what we can gather, this is about the time that the officers discovered a rifle hidden in one of the storerooms on the 6th floor of the depository building because an article by Time magazine reported that it was found minutes after the shooting and police searched the building very quickly. It was one of the first places that officers checked because a few witnesses had already approached them after they saw someone shooting from a 6th floor window.
Within 10 to 15 minutes after the shots rang out, it seems that Oswald left the depository. It isn't really clear why he left to us at that point because he was only halfway through his workday. He walked out of the building right past NBC reporter Robert McNeil, who was frantically looking for a phone to call his network office to tell them about the shooting. According to some official reports, Oswald walks down the street about 7 blocks where he is said to have gotten on a bus. Unfortunately for him, traffic is super backed up because of the chaos of the assassination, and people were running and milling through the streets, so the bus was really slow moving.
Pays to drive.
It seems that he wasn't on the bus for long before getting off the bus and deciding to take a taxi the rest of the way to his boarding house. Taxi driver William H. Whaley picked up Oswald at about 12:45 and drove him to the boarding house where it is said that he grabbed a pistol out of his room. It's verified by the boarding house supervisor that he arrived at about this time and left again very soon after. We're not sure if she saw him take the pistol out of his room or if the authorities just assumed that this is what he had done. This is only 15 minutes after the shooting.
At 12:57 p.m., less than a half an hour after the shooting, a man named Father Oscar Huber arrived at the Parkland Hospital to perform last rites for the president. It seems pretty unanimously stated by hospital staff at Parkland that there was nothing that they could do for Kennedy from the beginning. His situation was dire from the start. They had attempted to perform a tracheotomy, but this proved completely fruitless. However, Jackie had insisted that a priest be there to perform these duties prior to her husband's official passing. A couple of minutes after this was done, he was allowed to officially be pronounced dead by Dr. George Berkeley.
At 1:15 p.m., according to Business Insider's timeline, which is once again based off of the findings of the Warren Commission investigation, Officer J.D. Tippett was patrolling in Oak Cliff when he stopped a person who was walking. Officer Tippett had called into dispatch to tell them that he was stopping a man who fit the description of the alleged shooter, and this description had been broadcasted earlier via the radio. Some time had passed, and the next thing that the dispatcher heard was a civilian on Officer Tippett's radio saying that the suspect had shot the cop. She immediately sent officers to Tippett's location. When police arrived to check on Officer Tippett, they found that he was lying in the street, and he had been shot 4 times and was already dead.
At 1:26 p.m., Mac Kilduff, the press secretary for the White House, went on the air across televisions and radios all over America to make the confirmation announcement that John F. Kennedy had been killed. People were crying in the streets and flags all over the country were dropped to half-mast. America seemed in total disbelief.
It's now 1:40 p.m. and it seems that Oswald knows that he is being searched for in the suspected killing of John F. Kennedy. Not only that, it looks like he had just shot a cop. Officers who were searching the area were alerted by civilian witnesses that a disheveled and anxious-looking man was seen running into the movie theater without paying. Cops entered the theater to retrieve Oswald and found him sitting in one of the audience chairs. As the officers approached him, he attacked one of them, and this officer ended up in a wrestling match with Oswald and a revolver. Officer Nick McDonald gets the upper hand, punching Oswald in the face, and Oswald is then handcuffed and taken into custody. He almost immediately asked for a lawyer named John Abt, who happens to be the standard lawyer used by the Communist Party USA.
At 2 o'clock, the Secret Service and the Johnsons are ready to head back to Washington on Air Force One. They are at Parkland Hospital insisting that they take John F. Kennedy's body with them. The Parkland Hospital medical examiner for Dallas is upset and puts up a big fight about this. In the end, Roy Kellerman, Secret Service agent, gets into a heated argument with Dr. Earl Rose at Parkland Hospital about the chain of custody regarding the body. Dr. Rose argues that this is not a federal crime, so they have no right to take the body. In fact, he argues it's against the law, and at the time, it seems that he's right. It wasn't until 3 years later, after the Kennedy assassination, that the killing or attempted killing of a president would become a federal crime. So legally, Dr. Rose is supposed to do an autopsy before the body leaves the Dallas hospital. The Secret Service skirted around this by contacting the district attorney Henry Wade, and an agreement is made that the body will personally be attended by John F. Kennedy's White House physician, Dr. Berkeley, all the way to Washington. The Secret Service would end up confiscating the body of JFK prior to an official autopsy being performed at Parkland Hospital. The autopsy would now be done in Washington, D.C.
It seems important to note that prior to announcing the death of the president to the public, the press secretary for the White House, Malcolm Kilduff, had gone to speak with Vice President Lyndon Johnson. He wanted to know if it would be okay to announce the death of President Kennedy at that time. Reportedly, LBJ asked that Kilduff wait until after they left the hospital, stating, quote, "I think I'd better get out of here before you announce it. We don't know whether this is a worldwide conspiracy, whether they are after me as well, or whether they were after President Kennedy, or whether they were after Speaker McCormick or Senator Hayden. We just don't know." End quote. We understand that this was a very traumatic event that day that they had gone through, but the fact that he even said that fueled a lot of speculation alone, especially in conjunction with some of the other facts that we will examine as we move through this episode.
As they left the hospital, Jackie Kennedy walked out in front of reporters and onlookers, intentionally still wearing the pink dress that was badly stained with the blood of her husband. She told Lady Bird Johnson, Lyndon Johnson's wife, that she would not change it because she wanted them to see what they had done to Jack. Fun fact, Jackie's dress had never been cleaned and remains to this day in the National Archives. Per the wishes of the Kennedy family, it will not be seen by the public until 2103, 150 years after his death.
We might miss that boat.
Just a little bit.
I mean, I hope. It's a long time to be living.
I'm like a sea turtle, Nate.
I'm not. There's an end to this journey.
Whoa.
While they all made the flight back to Washington, John F. Kennedy's body in tow, Lyndon B. Johnson would take the oath of office mid-flight on Air Force One. The oath of office was administered by the first woman to ever do so, Judge Sarah Hughes. She wept the entire time as she was doing it. 99 minutes after the sudden and tragic loss of their beloved president, the people of the free world had a new leader.
An hour later, Oswald sat in the police station waiting to be questioned. His hands come back positive for gunpowder residue, which shows that he has recently fired a weapon. He was charged at this time for the murder of Officer John Tippit. About an hour after that, before Oswald had officially been charged for the murder of President Kennedy, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover was already on the phone with Robert Kennedy to let him know that they had already caught the president's killer. Oswald would be interrogated late into the night, taken from office to office as lineups are performed by witnesses. At one point he screams, "I didn't shoot anyone," at the press who is in his face the entire time he's being walked around. The driver of the bus that Oswald briefly boarded positively identified Oswald at this time.
The next day, November 23rd, Lee Harvey Oswald was arraigned for the murder of J.D. Tippit. Over the past 24 hours, he was questioned numerous times, and he was subjected to several lineups, although he was given approximately 8 hours to rest. During all of this moving around, he stopped at some point to give an answer to a few questions from the press, during which time he said that he really didn't understand the situation fully, and that he had been told basically nothing except that he was accused of murdering a policeman. He was then asked, "Did you kill the president?" He replied that he didn't, and that he had not been charged with killing President Kennedy. He hadn't even been told that this was a possibility, and it was at this moment that he had even heard of that. He would subsequently be questioned in the murder of JFK and repeatedly deny it. He never admitted to having killed JFK or Officer Tippit. In his testimony, there are several claims from Oswald that he never shot anybody, repeating over and over that he did not do it and that he was just a patsy.
A slightly more in-depth statement from Oswald in the morning of November 24th states this: "If you ask me about the shooting of Tippit, I don't know what you're talking about. The only thing I am here for is because I poop or pop." Did he really poop him? Did he really poop him? Okay. You girl, you wrote it. "The only thing I am here for is because I popped a policeman."
I accidentally typed pooped instead of popped, and Sam is having trouble composing herself. It's quite entertaining.
Well, it's midnight. "Because I popped a policeman in the nose in the theater on Jefferson Avenue, which I readily admit that I did because I was protecting myself. I haven't shot a rifle since the Marines. American people will soon forget that the president was killed, but I didn't shoot him."
I know, I'm not sure what that meant, but that is his quote. That's what he said.
"I did not kill President Kennedy or Officer Tippit. If you want me to cop out to hitting or pleading guilty to hitting a cop in the mouth when I was arrested, yeah, I plead guilty to that. But I do deny shooting both the president and Tippit." Obviously, Oswald wasn't the first or the last murder suspect to deny their charges, so his lack of confession isn't exactly strong evidence that he didn't do it.
According to CIA documents on November 24th, someone had been calling into the Dallas FBI office, telling them that they were part of a committee that had been formed to kill Lee Harvey Oswald, which seems kind of strange. Although there is a record of this happening, I couldn't find an official record of exactly what was said, though. Were they trying to help the police prevent it? Were they bragging about it? We aren't sure. According to a statement by J. Edgar Hoover, they advised the Dallas Police Department of these threats, and they asked the Dallas Police Department to provide increased protection for Oswald, but this was not done.
What?
The Dallas police needed to move Oswald to a more secure jail because this was a pretty high-profile situation, and it was obviously getting a lot of negative attention. So they took him down to the basement of their police station in an attempt to move him out of the jail quickly while under as much cover as possible. From the basement, they could pull right up to the exit and move him directly to a car instead of having to walk him through so many unauthorized reporters and bystanders who were hanging around outside of the jail. There was already a small crowd of approved press and policemen in the basement to see him off to his new abode.
As Oswald was being led through the crowd, a man named Jack Ruby stepped out in front of him. As he did so, right in the middle of the police station basement, he raised a .38 caliber revolver and fired one shot into Oswald's abdomen before being detained by many cops standing around him. Of course, the police pounced on Jack Ruby right away, one of them reportedly screaming, "Jack, you son of a bitch!"
That was really probably about how it was. Very emphatic. Go on.
While Jack yelled in return, "I'm Jack Ruby! You all know me!" And they did. Apparently, Jack Ruby had befriended a number of these law enforcement officers over the years, so it probably didn't alert them to anything highly dangerous that he was there, even if he wasn't necessarily supposed to be. And that was probably part of the plan.
Yeah.
Become a permanent fixture so they don't think anything about your presence.
Yep. He just slipped right in and stood, kind of innocuously in the crowd.
Lee Harvey Oswald was rushed immediately to Parkland Hospital, the very same hospital at which John F. Kennedy passed away 2 days earlier. One shot. It was enough to fatally wound the murder suspect, Lee Harvey Oswald.
Lee Harvey Oswald.
Lee Harvey Oswald. That's what you wrote. Lee Harvey Oswald.
You said Lee Harvey Oswald.
Lee Harvey?
Took the H from Harvey.
Lee Harvey?
Put it on Oswald.
Lee Harvey. Play it back. I did not.
Yes, you did.
Okay, I did.
Yeah, you did.
It was enough to fatally wound the murder suspect, Lee Harvey Oswald, and land Jack Ruby a charge for first-degree murder. Oswald was rushed to Parkland Hospital, and although he was in and out of consciousness much of the time, he did pass away that same night. An FBI agent went with him to the hospital in order to try to get something of a confession out of him, to get anything out of him. If there was a time that Oswald might admit to what they thought he did, this would be it, on his deathbed. Whether it be to bolster his name and ride off into infamy or to clear a guilty conscience prior to death. One would think that now he would confess. But interestingly, Oswald never did admit to killing John F. Kennedy. Interesting, but not conclusive. Although you would think he would have said he did it at this point, a lack of confession doesn't solidify innocence.
So who is this guy, one might ask? Jack Ruby? The man who pulled out a gun and shot Lee Harvey Oswald right there in front of everyone. He was a big shot of sorts there in Dallas. He owned several dance clubs and strip joints in the city, and like we said, he was actually pretty good friends with a lot of the police officers. They were said to have kind of a quid pro quo setup in which they allowed Ruby to get away with certain things regarding his business and not have to deal with the police too much. I'm not sure what the cops got in return. Jack Ruby's defense would always be that he was so upset about the death of John F. Kennedy that it drove him crazy. He also told officers and his attorney that he had heard on the radio that Jackie Kennedy would have to return to Dallas for the trial of Lee Harvey Oswald and face him in court. This further upset him so much that it caused him to experience an episode of psychomotor epilepsy. And he would state the entire time he stood in the basement waiting to shoot Oswald, he was unconscious and doesn't remember doing it.
So, we're both nurses, and I have never heard of psychomotor epilepsy, which apparently doesn't amount to crap because it's a real thing. According to the U.S. National Library of Medicine website, there are psychiatric aspects to this. They are described here as, quote, often being masked as psychiatric disorder or is associated with mental illness without clinically detectable seizures. Excitement states with amnesia may lead to violent antisocial behavior. So touche. Sounds about right. Good choice of defense. It didn't matter though. It doesn't seem as though a jury of his peers believed anything about psychomotor epilepsy anyway. He was charged pretty easily with murder of malice and found guilty in a court of law. He was sentenced at that time with the death penalty.
You're listening to the Prescribed Films Podcast Network, home to hundreds of hours of free podcast entertainment. The shows on this network all have a common goal, providing you with the best discussions about movies and other forms of entertainment media. The PFPN hopes to fill your earholes with audio joy. Visit our website with links to all the other amazing shows at www.thepfpn.com. Thanks for listening.
In that same CIA document that we mentioned earlier, J. Edgar Hoover addressed the fact that it was inexcusable for the Dallas PD to not offer more protection to Oswald after the FBI had warned them of the phone calls they had been receiving from a person claiming that they were going to kill him. But the FBI genuinely seemed much less concerned about the fact that they still could have gotten a lot of answers from Oswald regarding the Kennedy assassination and much more annoyed that his death would, quote, rile up the civil rights people. In the end of the document, it says, quote, it will allow, I am sure, a lot of civil rights people to raise a lot of hell because he was handcuffed and had no weapon. There are bound to be some of our society who will holler their heads off that his civil rights were violated, which they were, end quote.
On November 25th, 1963, John Fitzgerald Kennedy was laid to rest in Arlington Cemetery. According to an article in Life, written by Ben Cosgrove, as he described a riderless horse following Kennedy's body down the road. Kennedy was being carried in a horse-drawn carriage. The riderless horse was carrying, quote, empty boots reversed in the stirrups in token that the warrior would not mount again. It was a large affair, of course. People from all over the U.S., many world leaders. The world was there. People from all walks of life attended to show their respect for the slain United States president. As they were leaving, John F. Kennedy's 3-year-old boy, John Jr., turned back to salute his father before being led away by his family. Later that night, lonely and heartbroken, his wife, Jackie Kennedy, returned to his gravesite to lay flowers and be with him a little bit longer.
A week after the death of JFK and after a ton of debate within the White House, the new president, Lyndon B. Johnson, established the Warren Commission via executive order to investigate the death of the former president. The Warren Commission was named so due to the fact that it was headed up by Chief Justice Earl Warren. They did a 10-month-long investigation. Before their report even officially came out, there were rumors and speculation happening among the United States population. The Warren Commission members were being accused of intentionally delaying the release of the report until after the November election had passed. And later it would turn out that it seemed that this was true. They didn't want the report to interfere with Lyndon Johnson's chances of re-election in case the public wasn't fond of the result.
In reading an article about the Warren Commission by Time, they described the report as being amazing in detail, remarkable in its judicious caution and restraint, yet utterly convincing in its major conclusions. The writer went on to say that the wonder was not that the commission took such a long time to complete its report, but that they did so swiftly. The media absolutely hyped this report up and did nothing but sing praises for the Warren Commission and their hard work. In the end, the report concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald acted completely alone in the shooting of both President Kennedy and Governor Connally without physical assistance of anyone else or influence from any foreign entity. They also concluded that Jack Ruby and Lee Harvey Oswald were not connected in any way, at all. Like we said, the media did nothing but praise the report and the Warren Commission constantly, while polls shows that approximately 80% of Americans did not trust the report and believed that there was much more to the Kennedy assassination than they were being told.
The police first had been alerted to the college book depository building because the mayor of Dallas's wife, Mrs. Cabell, reported that she saw a, quote, projection sticking out of the window in that particular building during all of the commotion. Another witness also reported the projection. This man was Robert H. Jackson, and he was a photographer for the Dallas Times-Herald. A third witness also came forward to say that they saw actual gunfire coming from a window of that building. This witness was a 15-year-old kid named Amos Ewens. He was at the Dealey Plaza to see the president with his 9th grade class. He testified that he saw, quote, a pipe coming out of one of the windows of the depository while he stood right across the street. He had just excitedly exchanged waves with President Kennedy. Amos describes hearing 4 shots. He said that after the second shot, the pipe went back into the window and a man poked his head out. He saw a bald spot on the man's head and he could see the rifle laying across his hands as he leaned out. A third shot was fired right after that, out of the window before the man went all the way back in. Amos was asked about the 4th shot. He said after the man went all the way back in, he leaned back out again to fire the 4th shot before, again, retreating back into the window, and then at that point, Amos ran away. He wasn't able to give a good description of the man other than just that he had a bald spot that he noticed while the man looked down at his rifle. When Amos ran away, he ran toward the railroad tracks on the grassy knoll, and there he saw the police already searching that area. He told them that he had seen the barrel of a gun and took them to the building from which he saw the shooting. He said that the cops followed him there and then surrounded the building while some of them went into search. So this was likely only a few minutes after the gunshots happened, if that. Amos also reported in court that he heard a construction guy tell the cops that he saw a man run out of the back of the book depository just before they got there.
It was the 4th witness, Mr. Howard Brennan, that they got an actual description of the shooter and not just testimony that the barrel of a gun was seen. He had been sitting on a retaining wall waiting to see the president pass and was looking around when he saw a man on the 6th floor of the book depository approach the window and then turn around and walk away. This happened a couple of times, so it got his attention. Right about 12:30, he reports hearing the first gunshot, but at the time, thought it was a backfire from a vehicle. Then he heard the second shot. He thought it was a firecracker being thrown from the book depository window. So he looked up at the building, and Brennan described seeing a man taking aim and shooting. A man at the same window he had noticed earlier when he saw a person walking back and forth in the building. He describes the man at about 5'10", 160 to 170 pounds, fair complexion, slender, neat, young, in his early 30s maybe. He also said that the man was wearing khaki-colored clothing, from what we can gather. That was about it for the description, but it was something. Brennan ran to the first cop that he saw to tell them where the shooter was, and by 1:15, television and radio networks had already put this description out several times, and vague as it was, it did match that of Lee Harvey Oswald. Later, Brennan would pick him out in a lineup as being the man he saw shooting from the window, according to the Warren report. That's why Officer Tippit stopped Oswald as he was walking on the sidewalk and when the officer got out of his car to speak with him, approximately 12 people watched Oswald pull a gun and shoot him 4 times. 5 of them identified Oswald positively in the lineup after he was captured, with another 3 identifying him from a photo.
While the police were back at the book depository searching every room after witnesses put the shooter there, they found a gun in the storeroom on the 6th floor. It was tucked between some boxes and was reported to have been an Italian-made 6.5mm rifle with a scope, and it had a serial number intact. So they traced the rifle, and they found that it had been mailed in March of that year to a person named A. Heidel at P.O. Box 2915, Dallas, Texas. But it was the handwriting that they say helped prove their case. A handwriting expert matched the handwriting on the order form to Lee Harvey Oswald. Not only that, but in Oswald's wallet was a fake ID with his picture on it and the name Alec James Heidel. Oswald's palm print was also identified on the weapon, and Oswald's wife, Marina, identified the rifle as belonging to her husband. She even gave the officials a photo of him holding it. Fun fact, Oswald had purchased the rifle for $19.95.
That's it?
That's it. $20.
According to reports, a few people from the U.S. Marine Corps testified as experts on whether this would be a difficult shot to execute with this type of weapon. These included Ronald Simmons, who was chief of the Army Infantry Weapons Evaluation Branch of the Ballistics Research Laboratory, and he basically said that with the weapon and scope that Oswald had in his possession, he wouldn't have had to be an expert marksman to hit the president from that distance and angle. Another man, Robert Frazier, who is an FBI expert in firearms, said that it required no training whatsoever to shoot a weapon like this with a telescopic sight. Quote, "You must put the crosshairs on the target, and that is all that is necessary." It was described by another expert as an easy shot. So, it was testified by experts that this wouldn't have taken a skilled marksman to pull off, but keep in mind that Oswald was a Marine and did qualify above the minimum points for marksman in 1959 and above the minimum points needed for a sharpshooter in 1956. Plus, he was super familiar with this weapon and the scope because it was his.
Typically, the weapon was kept at the home of a family friend, Mrs. Payne. Oswald's wife, Marina, was living with Mrs. Payne, like we said earlier, while the two of them were separated, and at the time of the Kennedy shooting, Oswald was living in the boarding house. The Thursday before the assassination, he had gone to Mrs. Payne's home to visit his wife and children. When he left, Marina noticed that he took a package wrapped in brown paper with him. This had been reported to the authorities in Marina's testimony. This would have likely been the package identified by Mr. Frazier, the man who gave him a ride to work. And remember, Oswald had told him that the package contained curtain rods for his boarding house. Although the Warren Commission would report that they spoke to the people who ran the boarding house and found that the room was already supplied with curtains. So why would Oswald be bringing curtain rods? The brown wrapping was also reported to have been found on the floor next to the window that the witnesses reported seeing the shooting from. Of course, there was nothing in it at the time. The Warren Commission stated that Oswald's prints were found on this packaging as well.
Marina, Lee's wife, testified for the Warren Commission that he had been a quiet man outwardly, but he often had big opinions, especially of himself. He was always dominant and thought of himself as a revolutionary and a leader, yet also constantly felt extremely oppressed and would sometimes become very frustrated and violent. You would have thought that the Marines would have been a good place for him to let out some of this frustration, but it wasn't. He frequently got into trouble and had a hard time getting to know people, mostly because, well, people didn't like him. He promoted Marxism frequently to his bunkmates, and obviously this was unpopular. He didn't want to go back to America, so while he was in the USSR, he applied for a visa and the opportunity to remain there as a citizen. They did let him issue a temporary visa and allow him to stick around for a while, but ultimately denied him full citizenship. It was during this time that he met his wife, Marina. When it came time for Oswald to leave the USSR, she came back to America with him.
Apparently, Oswald actually had a history of at least one previous assassination attempt, but not against the president. He had apparently tried and failed in the assassination of the man named General Edwin Baker, only months before the assassination of JFK. He had done this by shooting him through a window at his home in the night with the very same rifle, barely missing. Somehow, the Warren Commission had obtained a notebook that belonged to Lee Harvey Oswald. They found it in a search of his room in the boarding house after the assassination of the president. Writings in the notebook outlined the exact plan, and it looked as though Oswald had been planning the attack on Baker for months. Baker was a U.S. Army general who had been fired by JFK due to being an outspoken white supremacist.
One thing that Oswald and JFK had in common was their unending arguments in support of civil rights. It makes sense, taking Oswald's personal views into account, why he would attempt to kill Baker, but it doesn't really make sense that he would assassinate JFK, unless he just loved communism so much, and it seemed that he did, that he would kill JFK over his anti-communist views and attack on communist Cuba and Russia. Supposedly, Oswald was a big fan of Fidel Castro and didn't take too fondly to the Kennedys constantly trying to kill him. Lee was said to have had a great desire to want to meet and speak to Castro. Marina testified that he had even mentioned once that he might hijack a plane to get there. On September 27th, less than a month before the Kennedy assassination, he did go to Mexico City and try to get to Cuba but was denied a visa. According to CIA documents, while he was in Mexico City, he telephoned the Russian embassy there and spoke with a well-known KGB officer in broken Russian. The whole idea that he had attempted an assassination before, though, showed that he was in fact capable of planning and executing such a thing, which would obviously be important in a case against him.
Oswald had never been caught or questioned for this previous assassination attempt, but he did leave a note for his wife that day telling her what to do if he gets caught or killed by police. She told the police about it in her testimony only after JFK had been killed. She has never changed her story that he was part of an attempt to end General Baker's life. However, the note has come under scrutiny since it was not found at the home of Ruth Paine upon the search of the house. It was found hidden inside of a book that was delivered to Marina at her hotel room while she was being watched by the Secret Service. The book was delivered by Ruth Paine, who didn't like Oswald to begin with, and neither his nor Marina's fingerprints were found on the note. It was undated and unsigned, and apparently Marina had such a history of changing her stories and inconsistencies in her other stories that it even became incredibly well known enough that the U.S. House Select Committee on Assassinations went into detail about all of her inconsistencies in a long memo. There were 0 witnesses that put Lee Harvey Oswald on the way to Baker's house or near Baker's home that day.
So we know from actual witnesses that Oswald was in fact in the book depository that day. We know that a weapon was found in a storage room in one of the top floors. We know that witnesses reported seeing someone shooting from a window up there, and others saw the protrusion of the firearm in the window. But witnesses on the ground heard shots coming from other places as well. The overpass and the grassy knoll fence line. There were a variety of witnesses who came forward that were dismissed or just plain not mentioned in the Warren Commission's report. If they were simply addressed as perpetuating rumor and speculation.
The bottom line, people weren't buying it. The general public consensus seemed to be that although the Warren report was long and seemed very detailed, and it does, we read it, there were so many things that weren't really addressed. If you pick and choose who to talk to and which witnesses to put forward before others, it's pretty easy to steer an investigation the way you want to. People still had a lot of questions and they didn't feel that this was adequate. Maybe this is just how the public reacts when something so big and impactful happens. That's what governments will have you believe. But maybe it isn't. Maybe people are smarter than they're given credit for. Maybe it's just really frustrating when you can tell that you're being lied to and can't do anything about it.
What?
Unimaginable.
Preposterous. Almost concurrently with the Warren Commission, a few lawyers and journalists took it upon themselves to form their own investigation into what happened on the day that John F. Kennedy was killed. And they came to vastly different conclusions than Lyndon B. Johnson's team of investigators. When this came out, it drastically pushed the Warren Commission's conclusion even further into the realm of public scrutiny. People started looking at the people doing the investigating. Were these people merely a group of credible independent researchers with nothing to gain but the truth itself? Or were they establishment cronies chosen by and answering only to the successor of the assassinated man himself? People began to wonder if Johnson just wanted to avoid having the FBI, Congress, and the Texas Court of Inquiry all poking around the situation. This would make it easier to give the public answers that the government wanted them to have. One investigating entity appointed by and answering to only one man. Highly suspicious.
I mean, I think so. Just an opinion.
You down with LBJ? No.
Just an opinion. It's just an opinion. This would become apparent a mere month after the Warren Commission released its report. Although the media praised the Warren Commission for its results, the public remained uncertain and untrusting. In a nationwide poll, it was revealed that the vast majority of Americans didn't believe that the Warren Commission tied up the loose ends. In subsequent years, this would be even more evident when authors and members of the media had begun investigating the Warren Report itself, following their same leads only to come to different conclusions, finding out that witnesses were neglected and ignored and their claims were ignored as well. The methods used weren't nearly as exhausting as what they were praised for. New information was coming to light that might have been previously kind of swept under the rug. These ignored witnesses were coming forward and talking to other people instead, people who chose to listen. Like popular authors, Jay Epstein and Mark Lane, who each released a book using logic, investigative grit, and intelligence in scrutinizing the Warren Commission in 1966. And this was starting a dialogue that spread like wildfire.
There were several key things presented by the Warren Commission that would come under scrutiny within the Warren Report, and we're going to take a deeper dive into each one of these later. One of those was the single bullet theory. It's probably one of the most brought up arguments out there. The Warren Commission states that there were only 3 bullets fired. The first one entered JFK's neck and exited through his throat before traveling through the seat in front of him and hitting Governor Connolly. It would come to be later known as the magic bullet theory. Let's start here with the autopsy report. Remember that the White House officials argued and fought to do JFK's autopsy themselves, while Parkland Hospital doctors thought it needed to be done there per the law. Of course, the White House won, and the autopsy was done by their own people, not an outside entity. People were already suspicious of that. It was determined that Dr. Humes would oversee the autopsy, and it turned out there were quite a bit of questions about his report. Notably, the lack of any kind of bullet trail through JFK's neck shown by X-ray, and on top of that, apparently there was no dissection of the neck at all. This is super important because it shows that they could not have conclusively shown the trajectory adequately and sustained the single bullet theory, in which they say the bullet traveled through the neck and into Governor Connolly. Governor Connolly stated in a couple of interviews that he knows that an entirely separate bullet struck him, and so does his wife, Nellie. Whoa, Nellie. Whoa.
The news was even suspect during this time. I'm just going to leave that there.
What?
I know. Not the news.
Not the news.
They would never lead us to believe things that weren't correct. Anyway, it seems that they constantly pushed the agenda of the legitimacy of the Warren Report, and when other very qualified experts would challenge things that they said, the news would just ignore them and not report it. The bullet that struck the president's head, for example. The Warren Report would state that it came from behind him, and that they would present physicians who would confirm this. People who saw the autopsy photos and read the report. But other, just as qualified physicians would see the same evidence and dispute it, saying there's no way it came from behind him, it came from in front of the president. They would only show interviews with the physicians who agreed that the bullet came from behind, and simply not speak with the other physicians who contended this. CBS was said to be extremely guilty of this. Further, there was a tape that they called the Zapruder film that showed the entire area and the assassination. It was called the Zapruder film because it was done by a man named Abraham Zapruder, and we have to comment that it is absolutely astonishing how still this man managed to remain while he continued filming the entire assassination, even while shots were being fired. You always see films of events like this, and they're all good until things start going down, and then the camera suddenly drops to the floor as the person filming panics. Not Abraham Zapruder, though. Calm and cool. His film was analyzed frame by frame at the request of the United Press International by a company named iTech. Each frame is 1/18 of a second, and they are individually numbered. CBS stated that iTech was a, quote, world-renowned company for film analysis. But it was never determined that they were necessarily renowned for anything. Apparently, a human figure, shadowy image could be seen on the grassy knoll in the tape, and iTech was tasked with analyzing the film specifically to see if they could tell if it was a person. iTech came out and said that it was not a person. It was nothing. Later, a woman named Marie Schoenfield, who works as an executive for United Press International, came out and stated that the chief executive and the president of iTech were agents of the CIA. Slight conflict of interest.
The Secret Service agent who climbed up on the back of the car testified to seeing brain matter and blood on the back of the car and the road behind the car. 2 men on motorcycles directly behind the president's car were splattered with his blood as well as their windshields. All of this was not mentioned by CBS. Then there is the matter of the way that the president's head flew violently backwards as the shot hit him, not forward as if the shot came from behind him. CBS smoothed this over by saying it was probably Jackie's movements beside him that caused his head to go back. All we can tell you is watch the video and see what you think about that. The Warren Commission initially had the Zapruder film in their possession, and in their report, they determined that just before Kennedy's head flew backwards, it actually moved slightly forward, and this was the point of impaction. It moved slightly forward just portions of a second prior to the driver hitting the accelerator, causing his head to go back with the movements of his wife beside him. Interestingly, though, when the Zapruder film was made available to be placed into evidence, it was found that 2 of the 3 frames had been transposed and mislabeled. Only 2 frames in the entire film, frames 13 and 14. The juxtaposition of these 2 frames does happen to make it look like his head does move slightly forward before then moving much further backward. When they are put back together how they are supposed to be, it's a smooth movement straight backward. J. Edgar Hoover addressed this in a 1965 interview in which he described it as a printing error. 163 frames, and these are the only 2 that are switched around. The 2 frames that would make their claim appear to be valid in the eyes of the public. Oops! So weird! But how do you prove that there was an intent to mislead here? You really can't.
There was another lady that could be seen on the Zapruder film directly across from him on the other side of the motorcade, and it looks as though she is also filming. You can almost clearly see what is likely a camera in her hands as she holds it up to her face when Kennedy passes by in the car. Obviously, this is a huge evidence, and the public wanted to know where that film was. The entire time, the FBI has always said that they don't know who she is and they never located her. Strangely, though, a man named Gary Shaw, who wrote a book on the assassination called Cover Up, claims to have found her while researching for his book. Her name was Beverly Oliver, and she told Shaw that after the assassination, she was shook up and went to her place of work since it wasn't very far from Dealey Plaza. She told him that she wasn't there for very long, and when 2 members of the FBI showed up and asked for her film, they told her that they would develop it for her and make 2 copies, keeping 1 for their evidence and sending 1 back to her. She claims that she has never heard from them or seen the film to this day. From where she was standing and the direction at which her camera was pointing, she would have had full view of both the book depository building and the grassy knoll. A possibly much better view with possibly a lot more answers.
It doesn't seem that too many people will argue that Lee Harvey Oswald, or at least someone, was indeed shooting from the top story of the book depository due to the witnesses who put a person there with a gun shooting at Kennedy. But it will be argued that he wasn't the only one, and there had to be a second shooter on the grassy knoll as well. It will be argued that not only witnesses who heard the shooting could place a shooter on the grassy knoll, but the bullet evidence would as well.
So why would the Warren Commission seek to smooth over the Kennedy assassination, blaming it on the crazed individual and not want to pull the strings on a deeper story and unravel the sweater of conspiracy? We're glad you asked. Many speculate that they just believed it was the best thing to do. If the murder of JFK was a plot by communists, it would cause the people to be angry, and the people would seek to push their government further into conflict or call for them to take immediate action against Cuba or the Soviet Union. This is not something that the government wanted at this time. And obviously, if they were involved, they don't want people to know. So
Nightclub owner Jack Ruby had been sitting on death row for about 3 years after shooting Oswald in that police station when his case was actually reopened in October of 1966. It was reopened because it was said that Jack Ruby's trial was not a fair one, so he was going to end up getting a whole new trial. Not only that, a change of venue would be instituted due to the incredible publicity that the case received and would be held in Wichita Falls instead of Dallas. Unfortunately, 3 months after that decision was made, Jack Ruby would pass away from lung cancer and would never see the second trial.
So now we have 2 major players in this situation who are dead, aside from our initial victim, John F. Kennedy. Lee Harvey Oswald and Jack Ruby could likely have shined a lot of light on some of the numerous questions that were soon to arise in the case and never die down. Questions and suspicions that would plague the American people for years and years to come.
So we're going to get into all kinds of weirdness when it comes to John F. Kennedy's assassination. But let's just start with one minor oddball. A man named John Latimer, who was a urologist from New York, jumped right on the JFK assassination train by writing an article in 1966 regarding the assassination from a medical standpoint. The Warren Commission came under intense scrutiny after the release of its report, and Dr. Latimer fiercely defended it publicly, with his medical knowledge. Dr. Latimer was the first independent doctor to be allowed access to the autopsy evidence. One of the key points of his whole argument was that after the second shot hit John Kennedy in the back, he immediately went into something called Thornburn position. This is when you can see Kennedy sit forward with his arms up at the elbows. The Thornburn position is a neurological response to spinal trauma. According to an article written by Wallace Milan, Latimer had gotten this information from an illustration in a 19th century medical journal and published the position in which he saw Kennedy sitting just before he was shot in the head as proof of where the bullet had likely passed. Although, in several subsequent writings, he changed his story considerably. An independent investigation into the findings of Latimer by a woman named Millicent Craner would later reveal that Latimer had consulted with 2 neurologists in coming to his conclusion, and she spoke with them. One of them had never even seen the Zapruder film, nor the position in which Kennedy was sitting. He had merely tossed the suggestion of Thornburn's position out there, and Latimer lapped it up. The neurologist had read Latimer's report and told Craner that he didn't have anything to do with writing it and that it was neurologically unsophisticated. Another doctor, Dr. West, told Craner that had Kennedy been in Thornburn position as a result of neurological trauma, he wouldn't have been able to then lower his hands as he is seen in the film doing. Wallace Milam got a copy of Dr. Thornburn's writing in which Thornburn position is described, and it sounds basically nothing like Latimer's take on it. It sounds like a reach, an unreliable, quote-unquote, expert witness who basically made a lot of things up in order to be in on a famous case. But unfortunately, he had a lot of followers who took what he said as gospel.
I know another doctor like that right now that's really super popular. Stop. We're not going to go further. That's all. Joke's over. Joking. Remember the bus driver who identified Oswald as being on the bus when the police asked him right after the shooting? Well, when the Warren Commission came to question him, he made a different statement. He said to them that he believes he was wrong in his identification of Oswald. He told the Warren Commission in an interview that he heard the description and thought that they were talking about a teenager named Milton Jones. Milton would later confirm his presence on the bus. The bus driver also states that there was one other man who fit the general description, but that he felt that he rushed to identify Oswald. He said that he felt his recollection was too vague for in his own mind to have been absolutely sure that Oswald was even on the bus at all. The plot thickens.
Another passenger of the bus, a Mrs. Bledsoe, did positively identify him though, and stuck with it. She described a hole in his shirt that was even present upon Oswald's arrest.
In 1979, there was a congressional committee put together about this case due to continued scrutiny and expressed distrust from the public. This committee worked on the Kennedy case alongside their regular jobs within the government, and after a few months, they even came to the conclusion that, dun dun dun, the killing of John F. Kennedy was very likely the result of a conspiracy. During this particular investigation, it is often pointed out the ridiculous number of suspicious deaths associated with it. For example, a man named George de Mohrenschildt was notified that an investigator associated with the House Committee investigation was going to come and speak with him. De Mohrenschildt was a close friend of Lee Harvey Oswald, and he told a reporter that he had prior knowledge of Oswald's assassinating the president. Before the investigator could get there, though, de Mohrenschildt was found dead by his daughter having been shot with a double-barreled shotgun.
Weird.
It was never really determined for sure whether he committed suicide or he was killed by someone else.
Like I said. Weird.
Yeah. We haven't even gotten into, like, the full twisty and turny of all this. It gets so crazy. Yeah.
There were a lot, and we mean a lot, of mysterious deaths related to this case. A woman named Karen Kupcinet called the cops a couple of days before the assassination, screaming into the telephone that President Kennedy was going to be killed. She was found 8 days later, strangled in her apartment, and it was never solved.
Grant Stockdale jumped or was pushed out of his office window after he returned from visiting Robert and Edward Kennedy, as he was a close friend of the president. When he returned, people who knew him reported that he had been acting really weird, talking about people who were trying to get him and how the world was closing in, before he died without leaving any kind of note or explanation.
In October of 1964, a woman named Mary Pinchot Meyer was shot twice in a park after she could be heard screaming. Long story short, it was never solved, but it was apparently pretty common knowledge that she'd been having an affair with JFK and had told her friend that the details of the affair were in her diary in case anything happened to her. When they went to her house after her death to look for her diary, they found another man in her house, CIA agent James Angleton, who said he also needed the diary. When it was found, he took it with him.
So weird. In 1971, an ex-CIA agent, Winston Scott, was writing a book about his time in the FBI and the CIA, which is never a good idea. People always die while they're doing that. He suddenly died of a heart attack after requesting a meeting with the then CIA director and notifying him of the manuscript. After he died, the CIA came and took the manuscript along with other JFK assassination-related stuff. Later, Winston's son, Michael, said that it was CIA agent named James Angleton who came and took these things from his father's office. When he got the manuscripts back, huge portions of it were missing due to national security issues. For the record, Michael Scott never believed that it was a heart attack that killed his father.
It was said that a woman named Nancy Carroll Tyler and Mary Jo Kopechne, who were both secretaries in the White House, told a man named Bobby Baker, who was a political advisor to Lyndon Johnson, that JFK had plans to replace Johnson on the Democratic ticket as his running mate. Bobby Baker and Johnson were super close, and there isn't much doubt that Baker let Johnson in on this bit of information. Nancy Tyler would later die in a plane crash in 1965. Mary Jo Kopechne would go on to die in 1969 in the car of Ted Kennedy at Chappaquiddick.
A woman named Dorothy Kilgallen was a reporter who interviewed Jack Ruby while he was in prison. She had excitedly told friends that she had information that would, quote, break this case wide open. Not long after that, Kilgallen was found dead. Her death was ruled a suicide by accidental overdose. Her notes were never found for that interview with Jack Ruby, though. They're gone. They gone.
This was only a small list of examples when it comes to people who appear to have been subsequently harmed in the wake of investigations into the Kennedy assassination. Unfortunately, we're going to have to continue the craziness of this situation into next week. You're welcome.
Yeah.
Another week.
It gets weirder, obviously, because we've covered who Kennedy was, the facts about his assassination, what kind of happened, a couple different reports and investigations that were going on. So you know all that stuff. Now we get into the weird stuff and all the speculation, which is fun.
You got the meat and potatoes, and now you're going to get
the gravy.
The gravy.
It has to be the gravy. Ooh. It is questionable gravy, but it is gravy nonetheless.
All gravy is questionable.
Yeah.
Secrets in the sauce.
No, it's not.
Yes, it is. So, we did try super hard to explain it all in one episode, but there was really no possible way to give a well-rounded picture of the Kennedys, his assassination, the investigations, and the conspiracies that followed in 1 hour. We appreciate your patience with that. It is just an incredibly deep story, and believe it or not, it gets so much weirder and more suspicious.
That sounded very news anchory. More suspicious.
And that's the way the cookie crumbles.
And that's the rest of the story.
And that's Walter Cronkite.
Okay, so that's going to have to do it this week for this episode of Bigfoot for Breakfast.
That'll do, pig.
That'll do, pig. Make sure you hit the subscribe button on whichever podcast platform you happen to be listening from and leave a rating and a review because it helps us out a whole bunch. We really mean that, it does. Don't forget to spread the word about the show. A little word of mouth goes such a long way. So if you know someone who might be interested in a show like ours, please tell them about it. Please.
Come on.
Come on.
Come on. Come on.
You can contact us through Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, or you can email us at bigfootforbreakfast@outlook.com. You can also give us a call. Give us a ring-a-ling-ling and leave us a voicemail. Give us a jingle at 641-812-2635. If you leave us a voicemail, we'll play it on our next episode. You can also text that number too. We will also just say it on our next episode.
We'll read it aloud.
Sam will do her best Walter Cronkite whilst reading your text.
No.
You'll have to watch a few YouTube videos and get it down. You have to. I already committed you. That's how life works.
Shit.
So don't forget to come back next week for part 2 of this Kennedy assassination episode because that's when things get really twisty and turny. Thanks again, and we will see you then. And remember, Soylent Green is people.
And don't forget that the best way to eat kale is with coconut oil so it slides off your plate into the trash. A lot easier.
Indeed, because kale's gross.
We stopped dropping pearls. I think that's where we've gone wrong. We stopped dropping pearls.
I don't understand.
Pearls of wisdom, like
We
the kale.
stopped dropping pearls.
Yeah,
I thought you were saying stop, drop, and pearls, like stop, drop, and roll.
but with pearls.
But you do it with pearls.
I'm a classy lady. I do everything with pearls.
I was not following at all. I don't know why, because duh, why would you not with pearls?
With pearls and Lee Harvey Oswald.
Lee Harvey Oswald. I can't even do it now. Lee Harvey Oswald. That's what it was. No, I didn't. No, I didn't. She said, play it back. Play it back. It's
With my best Tyrion Lannister accent. Play it back.
Balderdash.
Come at me, bro.